Back on October 7th, armed with AK-47s and motorcycles, Hamas managed to breach the Gaza fence, slaughtering and capturing hundreds of Israeli soldiers and civilians in southern Israel. They called it Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So what did the Israeli government know and when? It's a question almost no one in media is asking, but we are. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning Israel and Gaza. On October 7th, Hamas was able to carry out its shocking terror attack against Israel, despite Israel's intelligence, military, and security apparatus, commonly considered to be the best in the world. Bearing in mind Israel's incredibly sophisticated and capable defenses and brigades of trained IDF soldiers stationed near the Gaza border, the scale and the operational success of the Al-Aqsa flood attack surprised even Hamas. Hamas representative Ali Baraka explained to the Washington Post the ease with which Israel's entire security apparatus disintegrated, saying, quote, "We were expecting to get a smaller number of hostages and return to Gaza, but the Israeli army collapsed in front of us. What were we to do?" Well, in response to the Al-Aqsa flood attack, the Israeli military's retaliatory efforts, codenamed Operation Swords of Iron, has resulted in the deaths of over 100 journalists, 190 United Nations staff, 34,000 Palestinians, including 13,000 children, displaced nearly the entire Gaza population of 2 million people, and cost the United States almost $50 billion. So how did October 7th happen? Well, almost everyone in mainstream media was quick to call it an intelligence failure. The Guardian told its readers on the afternoon of October 7th that Hamas's murderous attack will be remembered as an Israeli intelligence failure for the ages. While the attack was still ongoing, on October 7th, Politico quoted Israel's former deputy national security advisor saying, quote, "It's a failure in terms of intelligence, operationally. It's clear that we were caught totally unprepared by this." And on October 8th, Jonathan Panikoff, former deputy national intelligence officer on the Middle East, who's now at the Atlantic Council think tank, firmly educated the public that, quote, "This was an intelligence failure. It could not be otherwise." In fact, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quickly tweeted, then deleted a statement saying that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of this coming attack, saying, quote, "Under no circumstances and at no stage was Prime Minister Netanyahu warned of war intentions on the part of Hamas." The tweet said that before it was promptly deleted. Why did Netanyahu's team delete that tweet? Did he, in fact, have intelligence that there would be an attack by Hamas? Well, the evidence seems to point to only one answer. Yes. Foreign security services, Israeli security services, and the Israeli public all knew that Hamas was planning a violent cross-border incursion where they would attempt to overrun and attack the kibbutz communities in southern Israel, and then take prisoners back to Gaza. And they also knew when. But it happened anyway. 10 days before the attack, and then again 3 days before the attack, Egypt's intelligence officials actually sent repeated warnings to the highest levels of the Israeli government. In one of those warnings, Egypt's premier intelligence minister, General Abbas Kamel, personally called Netanyahu and warned him that Hamas was about to do, quote, "something unusual, a terrible operation." Unnamed Egyptian officials told Ynet News that they were shocked by Netanyahu's indifference to the news. But Israel didn't have to trust or believe Egypt, because actually most of the warnings of the October 7th attack came from Israeli civilians and the Israeli military itself. The civilians and soldiers who brought these emergency warnings to the military were ignored, and in some cases, strangely enough, threatened with legal action. So let's go all the way back to 2022 and then work our way forward to the days before the October 7th attacks. In 2022, the IDF, through confidential sources or spies in Gaza, actually obtained the detailed Hamas Al-Aqsa flood attack plans. Codenamed Jericho Wall by Israel, that incursion plan called for a barrage of rockets to begin the attack, and then for gunmen to pour into Israel en masse via paragliders, on motorcycles, and on foot, and then take hostages back into Gaza. All of it, every bit of that happened on October 7th. Hamas followed its own blueprints that Israel already had in its possession with shocking precision. So Israel literally had the attack blueprints. But were they taken seriously by the IDF? Again, yes. The plans were diligently studied. In fact, a presentation on the planned attack was given to senior officers in the IDF's Gaza division. The presentation concluded with this sentence, quote, "This invasion constitutes the gravest threat that IDF forces are facing in the defense of Israel. So in response to all of this, did Israel's intelligence apparatus actually enhance or beef up their surveillance of the Hamas militants along the Gaza border? Well, actually, not only is the answer no, but stunningly, they did the exact opposite. They decided to entirely stop monitoring Hamas's handheld radio traffic because they saw it as a waste of effort. Even though during that same time, in 2022, Israelis living in the kibbutz communities near the Gaza border, most of whom have some type of military training because of Israel's mandatory IDF service laws, they were, according to Israeli media, picking up clear evidence that Hamas was practicing the breaching of the fence and conquering kibbutzim and seizing hostages and destroying everything in their path. Then in April of 2023, again, this is still 6 months before the attack, the IDF, according to Israeli media, actually did something even more surprising. They restricted the ability of Israeli citizens living along the border to monitor Hamas's wireless traffic. In September of 2023, that's less than a month before the attack, the head of the IDF's Devil's Advocate intelligence unit, which challenges prevailing narratives within Israel's military, twice alerted senior decision makers in both the army and the political spheres about Hamas's plans for a large-scale cross-border military operation. He reiterated those warnings in person at intelligence branch strategic assessment sessions on September 26th and September 27th. This is just days before the attack. During this period, again, just days before the Al-Aqsa flood attack, Israeli civilians residing in the kibbutzim near the Gaza border were witnessing with their own eyes and ears constant and enormous Hamas training exercises. The army reportedly turned a blind eye. One of these Israelis, Ben Shoshan, worked as a tour guide in the southeastern Israeli region surrounding Gaza. In a radio interview just days before October 7th, she remarked, quote, "Hamas has been training for weeks right up against the border, sometimes in massive numbers. I tried to warn the officers, but they told me I didn't know anything and that I was safe." On October 3rd, a journalist for Israeli Public Radio tweeted and made crystal clear that the bizarre and violent Hamas drills that were taking place on the Gaza side of the border were evident to everyone who was living alongside that border, including the Israeli military. The Islamic Jihad organization started noisy exercises very close to the border, with missile launches, simulating breaking into Israel and kidnapping soldiers. Didi Fold, a resident of Netiv Hatara, said, "It was significantly closer than previous times. The children wake up and they ask what's going on. There are explosions, booms. It is not similar to previous exercises." So it was clear to everyone that Hamas wasn't only planning to do something horrible, but it was also clear exactly what that horrible and evil thing was. According to a female IDF soldier who spoke to Israel's Channel 12 news program, she was constantly trying to warn her superiors about the gravity of the Hamas training exercises. And she was threatened with legal action, saying, quote, "We were told that if we continue to harass on this issue, you will stand trial." So, Egypt knew, the Israeli military knew, and the Israeli civilians knew. And yet 2 days before October 7th, the Israeli military took 2 entire commando brigades, that's around 100 soldiers, away from the soon-to-be breached locations of the Gaza border and sent them to the other side of the country, to the West Bank village of Huwara. Despite no Hamas presence being in Huwara, and despite there being giant Israeli dance parties taking place right along the same border fence where violent, escalating, and obvious Hamas drills of breaching and kidnapping were taking place. Does this make any sense? And have you heard about these dance parties? Because it turns out there's bizarre and inexplicable narratives surrounding the planning of these now infamous dance parties in Israel along the Gaza border. What had not been widely reported is the fact that there were actually 2 back-to-back dance parties in kibbutz Riyam, which is also the location of the IDF's Gaza division, and it's only 3 miles from the Gaza border. The first party, planned months in advance, was a party called the Unity Festival. It took place on October 5th and 6th. Then the Nova Festival, the October 7th party, was actually added last minute, only a few days in advance of the event. So for obvious reasons, any significantly large gatherings on the Israeli side of the border with Gaza require Israeli military approval. Again, this is a part of the story that virtually no American media network will talk about. According to Israeli media reports, Lieutenant Colonel Sahir Fogel, an operations officer at the IDF's Gaza division, opposed the approval of the Nova Party based on a couple of things: the last-minute nature of its event application, the intensifying Hamas drills at the border, and because if something were to happen, more soldiers were on holiday. It was the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. The lieutenant colonel explained his opposition to the party's approval to his superiors, and he was instructed to allow the event to happen. Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported that other Gaza division officers privately told of irregular conduct and pressure surrounding the approval of that party. In February of 2024, Elkanah Fetterman, the head of security of the Nova Festival, gave an interview to Israel's Channel 14 where he made a statement that has not been reported on by any American media. He said this, quote, "I had a guard at the festival who had served in the Ream division near the Gaza border. And a week before the festival, he sent me a voice message, basically warning me, saying, quote, Elkanah, something is going to happen over Sukkot. I just wanted to let you know there were a lot of warnings. I passed the voice message on to the local IDF officials, and they told me everything was all right." After the attack, Fetterman called his friend in the IDF and asked him exactly what he knew, saying, quote, "You were speaking in codes. Tell me exactly what they showed you." He told me, "Elkanah, they told me there was going to be an invasion and that they were planning to take over settlements. I just wasn't allowed to tell you that." And that's what happened. If he knew what he knew, a driver on the Gaza border, what did those above him know? Because he is a small screw in the system, end quote. The Hamas attacks were violent and brutal, and they've been likened to tragic events such as the September 11th attacks or even the Holocaust, which makes it strange that Benjamin Netanyahu and members of his party have at times described these attacks as somewhat of a political gift. Nassim Vaturi, a member of Netanyahu's party in the Knesset, referred to the attack as sort of a gift from God because they are being used to justify the current ongoing war, stating, quote, "We were meant to fight this war against Hamas, as is happening now, and luckily for us, it came from the heavens." Well, back in January, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that Israel did not have the domestic or international support to invade or destroy Gaza. He said the October 7th Hamas attack solved both of those problems for him. Listen to this.
"We couldn't get the domestic consensus to make such a definitive solution to the problem of Hamas. That is, no one would agree across the Israeli public to go in and basically destroy Hamas, go throughout Gaza and destroy Hamas. We didn't have the international consensus either. Nobody would understand why are we doing it. Both conditions were created because of the Hamas savage attack on Israel on October 7th.
All of this information has been reported in isolation and without context, that is until now, but it in no way excuses the violent and brutal Hamas attacks of October 7th, in which so many lives were lost. But it does raise an important question, a question that brave people have to consider. Did the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence community, and the political leadership of Israel allow this ghastly attack to happen to justify wiping out the population of Gaza? It also raises big questions for us. Is this a war of self-defense, or is it genocide, justified by an attack that Israel likely could have stopped had it wanted to? We've been taking a look at what happened on October 7th during the Hamas terror attacks, and part of looking at that day requires some uncomfortable realities. Here's one. During the October 7th attacks, what did the Israeli military do? Well, strangely enough, for hours, nothing. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning, Israel and Gaza. Before we dive into the evidence that suggests there was some type of military stand-down order on October 7th, it's important to remember that Israel is just slightly bigger than the size of the state of New Jersey. But for some reason, once the Hamas attacks began, the time it took the Israeli army and rescue teams to arrive, fight, and rescue Israelis at the different kibbutz communities and sites being attacked, well, that ranged anywhere from 4 hours to more than 20 hours. Even the New York Times has reported, quote, thousands of soldiers were less than 40 minutes from the towns that were under attack. So why did it take so long for help to arrive? For example, kibbutz Be'eri was under siege by Palestinian militants beginning around 6 a.m. That was the morning of October 7th. A video that Israeli media obtained from an army helicopter, corroborated by Israeli survivors, proves that there were more than 500 Israeli soldiers directly outside of the kibbutz entrance fully armed with Humvees and tanks, but not until 4:30 in the afternoon. That's 10 hours after the attack began. It took 10 hours for those soldiers to show up, but it gets stranger because the first rescue mission wasn't actually underway at kibbutz Bereri, again, according to Israeli media, until almost 7 p.m. That's 13 hours after the attack began. Atzival, a survivor of the Bereri attack, described to Haaretz, quote, 500 soldiers stood outside with equipment and vehicles. I remember yelling at them, we're being slaughtered, come in, save us. And no one said anything. So why? In our last episode, we discussed the Nova Music Festival. We showed you that the party was approved last minute, despite multiple warnings of a violent incursion from Gaza. And we've discussed how days before the festival, 2 entire brigades of soldiers were taken away from the area of the Gaza border and then sent to the West Bank. And you might think that immediately upon receiving information of a devastating attack on partygoers, military authorities would alert units to immediately exit their bases, race to the site of the conflict, and go on the counterattack, right? But that's not what happened. Haaretz reported, quote, at 7 a.m., the party organizer called Lieutenant Colonel Elad Zandani, the man tasked with approving the festival, and told him that terrorists were shooting the partygoers. He suggested that they fend for themselves. The first IDF forces arrived at the party scene at 3 p.m. That's 8 hours for a response time for one of the most efficient, capable, and well-militarized security forces in the world, operating in a country the size of New Jersey, with their Gaza division only a few miles away. What makes it even more strange, around 4 hours into the Hamas assault at 10:46 a.m., Israel was already launching operations and bombing targets inside of Gaza. So hold on, let that sink in. If Israel could begin an offensive attack into Gaza within 4 hours, why did it take more than 6 hours? In most cases, more than 10 hours, and in some cases, 20 hours to mobilize inside their own country to stop the ongoing attack, to defend the lives of their own people. Jonathan Pollard is an Israeli American. He's a former National Security Agency employee. He served 30 years in federal prison for giving classified information to Israel. Of course, you should always be skeptical of the claims of a former spy, but on a podcast, Pollard seems to suggest there was a military stand-down order in place on October 7th. And considering all the evidence, it makes sense.
I had friends who were helicopter pilots, attack pilots, who were sitting in their cockpits, ready to take off, fully loaded, ready to stop them at the fence. They didn't get their orders for 6 hours. They could hear it. They could hear the fighting. They were called by friends in the border kibbutzim in Mosavim that were being overrun and slaughtered, saying, help us, please. They're killing our children. They weren't given permission to take off. That will haunt my friends for the rest of his life.
The New York Times quoted Ben Zion, an Israeli military reservist who spoke to Israeli media. He said his unit voluntarily left central Israel in a convoy at 1:30 p.m. They got together and they left for the south on their own. He expected to see the roads packed with soldiers and equipment and armored vehicles heading south. Quote, the roads were empty, he recalled in an interview. Roughly 7 hours into the fighting, he turned to the reservists next to him and asked, where's the IDF? Now, we've thrown a lot of information at you here, so let's sum up the timeline. At 6 a.m., Hamas began their violent assault on southern Israel by launching hundreds of rockets and then breaching the border. At 10 a.m., the Israeli defense minister announced that Israel is at war. 30 minutes later, the Israeli military announced it was already identifying and bombing targets inside of Gaza. And from there, it took anywhere from 4 hours to 10 hours for army units to arrive, and then sometimes another 4 hours to 10 hours for them to actually engage the militants and begin to save Israelis. Now, between the trove of concrete evidence that suggests Israeli military allowed October 7th to happen by ignoring dozens of reliable and specific warnings, threatening soldiers with legal actions who tried to warn their military superiors, and taking troops away from the area of the Gaza border that was attacked, and now evidence that suggests there was some type of military stand-down order in place on October 7th, it's important to ask, what was October 7th? And what kind of war is the United States supporting? The brutal and deadly Hamas terrorist attack of October 7th is so central in justifying Israel's ongoing war in Gaza that Israel is actually outlawing questioning the October 7th government narrative. Israelis who spread information counter to the October 7th government narrative, which the Israeli Knesset calls falsehoods and propaganda, could face up to 5 years in prison. Why are they doing that? Well, in our next episode, we're going to take a look at another crucial aspect of October 7th. Once Israel finally did begin using their firepower and military to engage Hamas in southern Israel, did they exclusively target enemy militants? It is a critical question. The images and videos were used by the Israeli government to justify the military's heavy-handed tactics in their ongoing war against Hamas. But were they actually the result of the Hamas attack? Well, surely Israeli civilians were brutally killed by Hamas on October 7th, but there's mounting evidence that we think any responsible journalist needs to examine. Let's take a look at something called the Hannibal Directive. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning, Israel and Gaza. So far in this investigative series, we have discussed how Israel had received concrete and credible intelligence from foreign intelligence agencies, their own military, and even Israeli citizens about where and when the October 7th Hamas attacks would take place. The military rammed through the approval of the Nova Music Festival at the last minute, despite pushback from people within the army, and even threatened legal action against soldiers who tried warning and preparing for the Hamas attack. And when the attack began, what did the military do? Well, nothing. Evidence we've uncovered points to there being some type of military stand down at the beginning of the attack. But we need to take a look at another crucial aspect of that day. When the IDF began to finally use their firepower and military to engage Hamas in southern Israel, did they exclusively target enemy militants? Well, evidence actually points to no. To understand what the Israeli military did to their own civilians on October 7th, you have to understand the political aspirations of Hamas and what the goal of taking hostages is: political leverage. There are over 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails, 3,000 of whom have not been to trial or charged with a crime. When militant groups manage to capture Israeli civilians or soldiers, it gives them leverage to force a prisoner swap and to get some of their people out of Israeli prison. For example, in 1986, Hamas managed to kidnap 3 Israeli soldiers and bring them into Gaza. They demanded 1,150 Palestinian prisoners in return for those 3 soldiers. Well, after this, the military drafted a secret field order to prevent future kidnappings. It was called the Hannibal Directive. The directive gets its name from the Carthaginian general who chose to poison himself rather than allow himself to be captured alive by the Romans. Back in 2003, again, strangely enough, October 7th, 2003, 3 Israeli soldiers were taken hostage and brought into Lebanon. Following the activation of the Hannibal Directive, IDF attack helicopters fired indiscriminately on 26 vehicles, thus ensuring the death of their own soldiers and therefore robbing Lebanese militants of the ability to demand Israel make concessions. The last known application of the Hannibal Directive was 2014 in Rafah. Hamas fighters managed to capture an Israeli soldier, Lieutenant Haydar Golden. Instead of allowing the lieutenant to be used as leverage by Hamas, though, the military killed him, dropping bombs, missiles, and shells on the area he was being held, killing that soldier and also 100 Palestinian civilians. The scale of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th was entirely different, though, from those of the past. A retired Israeli Air Force general, Nof Erez, described it during a podcast with Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, saying this, quote, "The Hannibal Directive was apparently applied at a certain stage, because at the moment they understand there is a kidnapping, they immediately say, guys, this is a Hannibal. But the Hannibal we trained for all of the last 20 years is for a vehicle we know at what point the fence it enters, on what side it drives, maybe even on which road it drives. This was a mass Hannibal." Now think about that term, a mass Hannibal. We all know the Hannibal Directive means to kill your own. So what does mass Hannibal mean? Well, if you look at Israeli media, you're going to find some pretty interesting things. Let's read this quote directly from Ynet, a large mainstream Israeli media outlet. Quote, "In the week after Black Shabbat, October 7th, soldiers of elite units at the initiative of the Southern Command checked about 70 vehicles that remained in the area between the Otaf settlements and the Gaza Strip. These are vehicles that did not reach Gaza because on the way there, they were shot by a combat helicopter, an anti-tank missile or tank, and at least in some cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed, end quote. 70 vehicles. And in some cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed. These are Israelis killed by Israel. Again, only reported on in Israeli media. Here in the US, we keep seeing pictures repeatedly of cars burnt to a crisp as evidence of Hamas's barbarism. But was it Hamas's AK-47s and homemade rockets that burnt all these cars to a crisp? Or perhaps hellfire and anti-tank missiles? Tuval Eskapia is a member of the security team for the kibbutz Bereri. He set up a hotline so kibbutz residents could communicate with the Israeli army. He told Haaretz that, quote, the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate would-be hostages as well as terrorists. Shelled entire houses. Do we hear this in American mainstream media? That the Israeli military targeted and destroyed over 70 cars with Hellfire missiles that were filled with Israelis, and that they decimated entire Israeli homes with tank shells. A report in Haaretz, October 20th, notes that the Israeli military also carried out an airstrike on their own military base. That base was filled with Israeli civil administration officers and soldiers at the time. An Israeli woman named Yasmin Porat gave an interview with Israel Radio that the military undoubtedly killed numerous Israeli hostages during gun battles with Hamas militants. Listen.
בגינה של האנשים מהקיבוץ שיש 5 בני ערובה ששוכבים או 6 על האדמה בחוץ, ממש כצאן לטבח מול הירי של הימ"מ שלנו והמחבלים.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
לא, הם נהרגו מהחילופי ירי, תבין שהיה חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שזה כוחותינו ירו בהם? כשניסו לפסל את החוטפים, את החמאס?
הם חיסלו את כולם, כולל הבני ערובה, כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים. אני משוחררת בסביבות השעה 5:30, ב8:30 כנראה מסתיימת הלחימה, אחרי שהיה חילופי אש מטורפים.
IDF General Barak Hiram, who we covered in our previous episode, prevented hundreds of troops from entering kibbutz Bereri for hours on October 7th, when he finally allowed the IDF to go in. He ordered tanks to fire on multiple homes. The tank shells killed at least 12 Israeli hostages and 3 children. Recently, the UN published an investigation confirming several of these facts, namely that the IDF had in fact activated the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. Quote, the Commission is aware of the allegations that Israeli special forces used the Hannibal Directive to prevent the capture of Israeli civilians and their transfer to Gaza, even at the cost of killing them. The Commission documented one statement by an ISF tank crew confirming that the crew had applied the Hannibal Directive. So to recap, the Israeli military, Israeli civilians, and the United Nations all admit to the IDF purposely killing their own on October 7th. How many? Well, that's hard to tell. Tank shells hitting homes full of people, Hellfire missiles destroying at least 70 cars, mass Hannibal, but still, on social media, if you make such a claim, you're going to be hit with a community note and then promptly linked to a bogus fact-check website. The imagery of charred bodies and incinerated cars and homes are still used to this day to manufacture consent for Israel's ongoing assault on the Gaza Strip, while more than 37,000 Palestinians have been killed. During war, all sides produce propaganda, but has Israel been offering up images of the aftermath of their own assault on their own people and then presenting it as something that their enemy did? By now, you've heard the news. Israel launching a massive operation that rescued 4 Israeli hostages held by Hamas for nearly 8 months. Both the Biden administration and the Israeli government held this operation as a success, but others have been critical of the fact that 270 Palestinians were killed. The rescue operation was conducted in the middle of the day as Israeli forces, disguised as humanitarian aid workers, drove a humanitarian aid truck into the crowded market area of Nusrat. Once there, these forces began what they've termed a rescue operation, but others have termed a brutal assault. Assassinations, multiple aerial strikes on full residential buildings, and the entire outdoor Nusrat market left with bodiless limbs and headless bodies scattered everywhere, all under the cover of humanitarian aid. The mission appeared to be successful, as again, 4 Israeli hostages were in fact rescued after months of being held as hostages in the Gaza Strip among militants. Some reports say the operation also led to the death, though, of 3 Israeli hostages, 1 with American citizenship. Details regarding the exact role of the United States military remain murky, but a few details have emerged and they deserve our attention. First of all, during this so-called rescue operation, the head of the IDF was accompanied by none other than the United States CENTCOM chief, General Michael Kurilla. Here they are together during a more public meeting over the weekend in Israel. Now remember, that humanitarian aid pier that the U.S. military built off the Gaza coast, well, people originally thought this military installation had more sinister aims, but they were called conspiracy theorists. Well, during the operation, an IDF soldier at the U.S. Gaza aid pier posted this video to social media. You can see an Israeli military helicopter taking off, and behind it, parked on the dock, you can see a few Israeli army vehicles and also humanitarian aid trucks. The aid truck that allowed the soldiers to disguise themselves as humanitarian aid workers reportedly left from this very area. The video actually caused a stir, especially after the rescue operation, because the U.S. government has come out to now deny accusations that that humanitarian pier was used in the Nusret assault. U.S. Central Command tweeted that, quote, an area south of the U.S. facility was used, but by the Israelis. But again, look at the video. How far south are we talking? A few meters? This survivor, speaking from a makeshift hospital, explained that 10 soldiers exited the fake humanitarian aid truck and shot him with 3 bullets in his chest, arm, and leg. Then he says Israel began to intensely bomb the area with fire belts, meaning dropping large amounts of bombs indiscriminately.
مارك في الشارع اجى شحن صف كله اواعي وكله طناجر يعني تقول واحده من رفح يعزل عنها ما بنسوا قال لهم نازلين بيجي 10 قوه خاصه نزلت الطخطخ خدت 3 اطلاق في صدري وفي ايدي ونزلوا اشتباكات طخ طخ.
Here's an interview with 14-year-old Ahmed Mohammed Yaqub Matar, a Palestinian boy who lives in Nusret. The interview is making rounds on Arabic social media, U.S. mainstream media doing their best to ignore it. You can probably see why. Ahmed explains what happened when soldiers raided his home during the operation and where the soldiers were from.
هاجم علينا في الدار مش قوات إسرائيلية، هذا القوات الأمريكية، وبايدن هذا اللي بيقول لك حالات إنسانية نودع غزة وعمل المينا قاعد بدخل في المينا دبابات من المينا واللي قتلنا واللي قتل أخوي واللي طخ أخوي هذا من عنده من جيش بايدن.
So despite the U.S. military's so-called aid dock in Gaza being part of the operation, the head of the Israeli military being with top U.S. military officials during the operation, and Palestinians' testimonials of Americans being amongst the soldiers, the U.S. continues to deny any direct American involvement. More than 300 days ago, when Hamas carried out their October 7th attack on Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu likened the attack to Pearl Harbor and even the Holocaust. Enemies of civilization, bloodthirsty terrorists, savages, genocidal barbarians, and Nazis. These are all words that Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have used to describe Hamas. So it might come as a little bit of a surprise that Israel, while designating Hamas a terrorist organization, has been consistently supporting these genocidal barbarians with suitcases filled with hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning Israel and Gaza. Although Israeli support for Hamas was happening as recently as last year, it began in the 1980s. See, in the 1980s, Israel directly supported Hamas because they wanted it to become more powerful as a governing authority than the secular, non-religious PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization. That's a name you haven't heard in a while. See, Israel knew that turning a national struggle into a religious struggle, or a jihad, would allow Israel to frame Palestinian liberation as the aim of only Islamic fanatics. Former Israeli General Yitzhak Pundak told the New York Times, quote, "The Israeli government gave me a budget, and the military government gave me a budget, and I financed the opening of as many mosques and schools as possible. We wanted to strengthen Islamic institutions." Well, for decades, this social support system cultivated the political and religious ideologies that now drive Hamas militants. Adults who once attended the very mosques and schools directly funded by Israel. It wasn't merely about supporting Islamism and passively wishing it would yield religious leadership. Israel actively engineered Hamas's takeover of Gaza. According to a leaked diplomatic cable published by WikiLeaks, Israeli Defense Intelligence Chief Amos Yadlin explicitly said in 2007 that, quote, Israel would be happy if Hamas took over Gaza because the IDF could then deal with Gaza as a hostile state, end quote. So in 2012, with the explicit permission of Israel, the government of Qatar began delivering suitcases filled with millions of dollars in cash every month to the ruling party in Gaza, Hamas. According to Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Qatar delivered $1.1 billion in U.S. cash and Qatari rials from 2012 to 2019. While working in Gaza, Reuters photographer Ibrahim Abu Mustafa took photos of Hamas government employees after they received their monthly salary in U.S. dollars. Israeli journalist Barak Ravid noted that, quote, Israel's coordination with Qatar over the transfer of money to Gaza is one of the most bizarre elements of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a paradox where Israel allows funds to Hamas while considering them a terrorist organization, end quote. So why? Israel facilitated the transfer of more than $1 billion to Hamas for political reasons. By bolstering Hamas and ensuring they remain the dominant political force in Gaza, Israel effectively minimized the chances of the more secular Palestinian Authority, which already controls the West Bank, from coming to power in Gaza. See, this strategy hinders the formation of a unified Palestinian state. And Netanyahu, well, he actually said this during political party meetings in 2019. According to Haaretz, Netanyahu told other members of his party that, quote, anyone who is against a Palestinian state should be for sending money to Gaza because keeping Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank helps to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. In an interview with German media, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Omer said, quote, Netanyahu supported and advanced Hamas in Gaza. Netanyahu wanted to keep Hamas alive because he thought that if Hamas would remain in power in Gaza, it would divide the Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza, and so it would prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. Predictably, this strategy of channeling billions of dollars to their so-called greatest enemy backfired on Israel when Hamas launched its cross-border attack on October 7th. And for Americans, not only are we not told this incredibly crucial, maybe the most crucial part of this entire story between Israel and Hamas, but we're also left footing the bill, using billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to defend Israel from a monster that Israel itself helped to create. As the former Israeli religious affairs head, Avner Cohen, said, quote, Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation, end quote. The front lines of the war between Israel and Hamas are expanding and moving beyond Gaza. Just last week, Yemen's Houthis intensified their involvement, going from simply attacking Israeli-bound cargo ships to now navigating an armed drone over 1,200 miles, evading Israel's Iron Dome defense system, and managed to strike inside Tel Aviv, causing a massive explosion. And in just the last couple of weeks, in addition to their ongoing war in Gaza, Israel has attacked or been attacked by Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. continues to promise Israel unconditional and limitless support. But has anyone even asked if this support is legal? I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning, Israel and Gaza. According to the 1976 Symington and Glenn Amendments of the Armed Foreign Assistance Act, which is now part of the Arms Export Control Act, the United States cannot give foreign aid, whether it's economic or military, to any nuclear-armed state that is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty or the NPT. But here's the thing. The United States gives billions of dollars every year to Israel. And according to all international arms organizations, Israel has anywhere from 90 to 400 nuclear warheads. And Israel has not signed the NPT. So how does this legally happen? Well, the United States and Israel simply pretend that Israel does not have nuclear weapons. Literally, that's what's done. It's called nuclear ambiguity. This nuclear ambiguity, which allows Israel to continue to receive billions from the U.S. and also operate and maintain their nuclear arsenal with absolutely no international oversight and zero regulation, is maintained and preserved through the threat of force. Due to a previously top-secret gag order, get this, all U.S. government agency employees and contractors are forbidden from discussing Israel's nuclear weapons program. Even insinuating or mentioning information that's already in the public domain is forbidden for all federal employees and contractors. It sounds hard to believe. Let me give you an example. James Doyle used to work at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico as a nuclear security specialist, and he violated the gag order. Doyle wrote an academic article arguing that nuclear weapons do not do a good job at deterring countries from attacking one another. This is what he wrote, quote, "Nuclear weapons did not deter Egypt and Syria from attacking Israel in 1973, Argentina from attacking British territory in 1982, or Iraq from attacking Israel during the 1991 Gulf War." A clear reference twice to Israel's nuclear weapons. Well, Doyle's security clearance was promptly withdrawn. His home was raided, his computers were seized, and he was fired from the Department of Energy. So apparently, that's how it works. In 2018, The New Yorker published a stunning report in which they discuss another way that Israel's nuclear ambiguity is enforced: secret presidential letters. According to former U.S. officials and former Israeli officials, every recent U.S. administration since the Clinton administration in 1993 has performed the same ritual as they came into office. They all agreed to undermine U.S. law by signing secret letters brought to them by hand by their Israeli counterparts, stipulating that they will not acknowledge what everyone knows, that Israel indeed has nuclear weapons. The National Archives is currently refusing to release the letters, arguing that even confirming their existence would violate the secrecy pact. So, there's a gag order that stops all federal employees and contractors from simply acknowledging Israel's nuclear weapons, and U.S. presidents sign secret letters promising not to acknowledge or pressure Israel to do anything relating to their proliferation status. Well, that means asking questions like these are entirely off limits, enforced by the threat of government violence or lawfare. But all this information does lead to a series of questions, like these. So where does Israel dispose of its toxic waste generated by its program? Are Israel's nuclear weapons ever used to coerce the U.S. into making adverse policy decisions? What about its allies? Besides apartheid South Africa, has Israel offered any of its nuclear weapons for sale to other foreign countries, to U.S. adversaries? Has Israel mounted nuclear weapons onto its German-supplied Dolphin-class submarines? What about their American-supplied F-35 jets? We don't know, because no questions are allowed. And what is the cost? The dollar amount for Americans of this nuclear ambiguity policy? Well, it's not cheap. To be exact, almost $240 billion of military and economic aid that has gone from U.S. taxpayers since the passing of the Symington and Glenn Amendments. That's far more than the United States spent rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan. And none of that, $250 billion, should have been allowed under U.S. law. That's the price of keeping Israel secret. $250 billion. And again, where is the International Atomic Energy Agency and international nuclear inspectors, the same ones who monitor every other nuclear armed country in the world? We don't know, because you're not allowed to ask. Before the war, Israel's Christian minority were already being targeted with dispossession and violence. In Jerusalem's Old City, narrow streets line the ancient neighborhood, and Jewish Israeli civilians spitting on and attacking Christian clergy members is commonplace. Here's a video from a few days before October 7th of Christians in the Old City of Jerusalem carrying a cross. As a group of Orthodox Jewish Israelis walk by, they spit at those Christians. Another video from only a day earlier shows Jewish Israelis walking by a church entrance in the Old City of Jerusalem and spitting in the entrance as a symbolic disapproval of the Christian faith. Now, perhaps this is physically harmless, but it is representative of the anti-Christian mindset of some Israelis. It's become pretty mainstream to believe that Christians don't belong in Israel, and only Jewish people do. Back in April, Brother Matteo Minari was upstairs in his office at the Church of the Flagellation, a church along the path where Jesus is said to have carried his cross on his way to his crucifixion. Minari heard a commotion downstairs in the church and found that Israelis had broken into that church and thrown the statue of Jesus Christ off the pedestal. The statue of Jesus remained partly intact despite damage to the statue's face and both legs breaking. The Dormition Abbey in Jerusalem is identified as the place where the Virgin Mary died. A dozen or so Christian missionaries still live there. Well, a few years ago, that mission, the Virgin Mary's place of death, was attacked and vandalized by Israelis. The graffiti on the ancient walls read, "Death to heretical Christians, the enemies of Israel, and may his name and memory be obliterated," in reference to Jesus. According to Haaretz at a Jewish school, the leader of an anti-assimilation group, Binsi Gopstein, told students that it's, quote, mitzvah, or a good deed, to burn and destroy Christian churches. Gopstein compares Christians to vampires and says that they should be expelled from Israel, with religious celebrations like Christmas being banned. And this is not just some random guy with no political power. Here is Binzi Gopstein rallying and hanging out with Israel's current Minister of National Security, one of the most powerful people in the current Israeli government. The Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem has published an emergency press release that reads this, quote, "The Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem is under possibly the greatest existential threat of its 16th century history. This existential territorial threat fully extends to all of the Christian communities of Jerusalem. The police have chosen in the last few days to demand that all members of the Armenian community vacate the premises. We plead with the entirety of the Christian communities of Jerusalem to stand with the Armenian Patriarchate in these unprecedented times, as this is another clear step taken toward the endangerment of the Christian presence in Jerusalem and the Holy Land," end quote. So if that's what's happening inside of Israel to Christians, the only democracy in the Middle East, what's happening to Christians where the Israeli military is actively engaged in war? St. Porphyrius Orthodox Church is located in Gaza City. It is believed to be one of the oldest Christian churches in the entire world. St. Porphyrius was a 5th century bishop in Gaza whose tomb lies under that church. Now, this was the church before October 7th, and this is the church now. On October 19th, that church grounds were hit on all sides by Israeli airstrikes as both Palestinian Christians and Muslims took refuge there. By what some consider a miracle, a crucifix atop that church remained undamaged and untouched. The strike killed 18 people and injured many more. The Holy Family Church, built in 1974, that's Gaza's only Roman Catholic church, and it became a shelter for local Christian communities once the war began. It was hit by an airstrike on November 4th. The Byzantine Church of Jabalia was built in 444 and is considered one of the most important churches in Levant. It was discovered in 1997 while building a road in Gaza. It is a religious and archaeological site. That site took years to be excavated and restored and was opened with a celebration headed by the most senior Christian cleric in Gaza. In October, it was destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. And as a new front in this war opens up in Lebanon, it's important for Americans and especially Christians to remember that Lebanon is home to a giant Christian community. And the media almost completely ignores this fact. There are 2,405 churches in Lebanon. Almost 40% of Lebanon is Christian. But just last week, Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon killed 350 people, including more than 60 women and children. So should Americans, especially Christian Americans, be allowing billions of their taxpayer dollars to be used to ethnically cleanse, attack, and bomb holy sites and Christian civilians? What has happened in the 11 months since Israel launched its war against Hamas? And what does that war look like for the 2.4 million Palestinians in Gaza? Well, 80% of the buildings and homes have been reduced to rubble. At least 45,000 Palestinians have been killed. And according to the Gaza Health Ministry, there are over 1 million cases of infectious disease. That's almost 1 for every 2 Palestinians. So what will happen when this war is over? And what will Gaza be like? I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning Israel and Gaza. To understand who will be living in Gaza when this war is over, it's important to hear how the state of Israel, one of the 2 warring parties in this conflict, answers this question. In an Israeli Hebrew language newspaper, an IDF general, Giora Elin, wrote this, quote, "Creating a severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a necessary means to achieve our goal. Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist," end quote. Another idea put forth by Israel's top brass is, quote, "voluntary migration or transfer to Africa." According to the Times of Israel, Israel is in talks with the Congo, a country 3,000 miles from Gaza, for potential absorption of the Palestinians in Gaza. So, if Palestinians will no longer be in Gaza, and that's what it's looking like, who will be there? Well, it seems like Israelis. From 2005, when Israel first pulled out of Gaza, up until October 7th, when the war between Hamas and Israel began, Israel had no presence in the Gaza Strip, aside from an occasional military attack or bombardment. There has been no military or occupation infrastructure inside Gaza. However, the war has created conditions for Israel to reoccupy the Strip, which has been a long-standing and clearly articulated aim of Israel's ruling party. And it's not one village we're talking about or just a few towns. According to Haaretz, who interviewed IDF soldiers and analyzed satellite images, the Israeli military has taken complete control of 26% of the Gaza Strip, building entire military compounds and even paving their own highways. While some of the military is busy fighting Hamas militants, there are entire brigades of hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of explosive experts, and hundreds of construction workers, demolishing the old Gaza and building the infrastructure needed for the new, occupied, and settled Gaza. Here's a satellite photo of a giant region of Gaza that is now entirely occupied and controlled by Israel. As you can see, on October 8th, 2023, you had a densely populated metro area of Gaza with several universities, several hospitals, shopping centers, and a handful of resorts. Now, all of that is gone. The Israeli military surgically flattened the entire area, built 3 fully functioning state-of-the-art military bases, and paved a highway from Israel through Gaza to the Mediterranean Sea. And if there's any question remaining on why this giant 4-mile by 4-mile corridor was constructed, as Haaretz pointed out, painted in an Israeli flag colors at the end of the road is this, a phrase that translates to, without settlement, there is no victory. Meaning to Israeli soldiers, winning the war goes beyond beating Hamas, something Americans have heard repeated over and over. But winning means turning Gaza into a militarized, Israeli-controlled Jewish enclave. It's not just soldiers. Back in May, according to Israeli media, Netanyahu's right-hand man, Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, stated bluntly that after the war, he would be very happy to live in Gaza. We don't hear these stories in the U.S. Only the state of Israel, no one else. A full occupation of Gaza, Israeli control, Jewish settlement. I will be very happy to live in Gaza, he said in an Israeli newspaper. Yishai Flesher, a political leader and rabbi in Israel, took to X to post a photo of IDF soldiers on a beach in Gaza with the caption, quote, Israel is back in Gaza, and we are here to stay in our ancestral land and on our ancient beaches. In addition to the state of Israel already taking complete permanent control over large areas of the Gaza Strip, and officials making public statements about living in Gaza after the war ends, Israeli citizens are wasting no time making their desire to live on the beach in Gaza known to the government, even breaking the law to do so. Israelis have been regularly breaching military crossings which connect the Israeli town of Sadat to northern Gaza, bringing plywood, vinyl, sheet metal, and power drills to construct what they call symbolic outposts with the permission of the Israeli military. These small buildings that Israelis are building on the Gaza side of the border are meant to signal to the government how ready they are to live in Gaza. Here in the U.S., we're told that we should prioritize sending billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to Israel over dealing with our own issues here at home because Israel needs to be able to defend itself. Well, it seems like what initially appeared as a defensive war is appearing more like an offensive war with the expansionist goal of the permanent military occupation of the Gaza Strip in order to ensure Israelis can safely live by the beach. And Americans are paying the bill.
We couldn't get the domestic consensus to make such a definitive solution to the problem of Hamas. That is, no one would agree across the Israeli public to go in and basically destroy Hamas, go throughout Gaza and destroy Hamas. We didn't have the international consensus either. Nobody would understand. Why are we doing it? Both conditions were created because of the Hamas savage attack on Israel on October 7th.
All of this information has been reported in isolation and without context, that is until now, but it in no way excuses the violent and brutal Hamas attacks of October 7th, in which so many lives were lost. But it does raise an important question. A question that brave people have to consider. Did the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence community, and the political leadership of Israel allow this ghastly attack to happen to justify wiping out the population of Gaza? It also raises big questions for us. Is this a war of self-defense, or is it genocide, justified by an attack that Israel likely could have stopped had it wanted to?